It's time for World Edition on Pod TV. And of course, it is Friday, the 17th of May, and all kinds of things are taking place in the world. And of course, we've got another special guest, so we'll be talking to them and seeing what they've got going on as well. But first, let me just get to a couple of the news items and all along those lines. So it looks like Gaza has received its first aid delivery from a U.S. pier. So the U.S. military is starting to deliver aid to Gaza through the floating pier. So that is some good news in that part of the world, even though there is definitely continuing conflict over there as well. And it also looks like a French Jewish umbrella group is angry after a man suspected of planning to set a fire to a synagogue in Rohan. So definitely that's something that we're seeing in the news as well, as the police apparently shot a attacker that was trying to set fire to a synagogue in that part of the world as well. And Ukraine hits the Sevastopol power station with a huge drone attack, according to the Russians. So Ukraine is apparently also halting Russia's Kharkiv advance, and Putin says that the offensive aims to create a buffer zone. So definitely that conflict is continuing to rage on and all along those lines. And Israel tells the International Court of Justice, South Africa's Gaza allegations are totally divorced from fact and all along those lines. So they are definitely coming up with that notion and everything. And the Saudi normalization could abort Israel's Rafah operation, but there are some folks that are saying that it could possibly not solve Gaza's troubles. But Israel is resisting a grand bargain as the U.S. and Saudis are working on a security pact. And apparently the Vatican is revamping the norms to evaluate the visions of Mary as it adapts to the internet age and all in that space. So definitely, I was also reading an article earlier where apparently the Vatican was getting some pushback from some of the conservative wing, and a lot of that conservative wing is in this area of America, North America, that is, and all along those lines. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because I know there's been some conflict between that part of the Vatican and all along those lines, because there are definitely some divides in the Vatican, just like there are divides in other parts of the world as well. As a matter of fact, I was reading something earlier where they were talking about how the divide is out there and how some of it is over the notion of having lay people be more involved, and also that apparently the current pope is wanting to see more acceptability of some of the LGBT community in terms of the Catholic Church and some of its stances and all along those lines. At least that's the impression that I got, and I could be wrong. But it'll be interesting to see what folks have to say about a number of these issues. And like I said, in a little bit, I'll be bringing in my guest and seeing what she's got going on as well. So definitely a number of things that are going on, including Putin and Xi are agreeing to expand the Russia-China military cooperation. So that is something else that is going on as Putin concludes a trip to China by emphasizing its strategic and personal ties to Russia. So definitely it looks like there are some people that are thinking that Biden might even be pushing these folks into each other's arms, but we'll see if that is the belief of all folks and all along those lines. But it'll be quite interesting to see what goes on in that space. And of course, there's political divide in the UK as well, because the UK's opposition Labour Party unveils its pledge to voters in hopes of winning the next election. So definitely it looks like the gentleman Keir Starmer has a plan for the government and all along those lines. So it'll be interesting to see whether folks go with the current government or go with somebody in a different part of that political system and all along those lines. And of course, we still got that political hearing going on and that court case going on with Mr. Trump. So we'll see what folks have to say about that as well. So there's definitely a call for these presidential debates. So it looks like we're going to have some presidential debates, including one in June. So apparently, Trump is saying anytime, anywhere, any place, and definitely looks like Biden's team had a few demands for a Trump debate, and apparently one of them is no crowd. So, but I'll see if that's the actual case or how that's going on, and all in that space. But definitely there is calls. I think I've heard as many as 3 debates, but one of them is supposed to be coming as early as June. And Detroit is seeing its first population growth since 1957. So apparently that is revealing America's fastest growing cities. And apparently Detroit is seeing a population increase, and Texas is dominating the list of America's fastest growing cities. So definitely there's a lot of things going on in that space. And the main mass shooter family says his brain was hijacked by injuries tied to his military. So definitely there are some folks that are trying to cope with the effects both of the person that led the assault as well as, of course, the victims and everything in a lot of these mass shootings. I know we've had a number of incidences right here in Durham, North Carolina, and they're trying to figure out how to curtail that, not just here, but in other parts of the world as well. So definitely it'll be interesting to see how people react and whether this whole notion of gun control and other things become important issues. And of course, people paying attention to the climate. And apparently in Houston, there was a Houston storm that had at least 4 killed and power cut in 900,000 homes and businesses, as there was a storm that tore out windows out of a high-rise building. And it was definitely a very deadly storm. And folks are trying to figure out when their power will be back on and all along those lines. So like I said, we've got the guests, so we're going to see how the guests are doing, some of their thoughts and things that they're involved with as well. So get ready to bring them up and see what is going on in their world. And then we've got our regular host as well and everything, our regular folks. How are you doing, Miss Jennifer? So what is your take on some of the things going on in the world and just in general? If you want to share a little bit about yourself here on World Edition, we would love to hear your thoughts just on what's going on in the world.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to meet you. I'm coming to you from Massachusetts. I'm up north of Boston in Gloucester, America's oldest seaport for folks who might not be familiar with Gloucester. And I just listened to your excellent roundup of all the things that are happening here in the US and also around the world. And I'm just sort of shaking my head and thinking, wow, some good news would be nice.
Yes. So share some of the good news things that you've got going on and some of the things that you're doing and some of the projects that you've got going on and even a little bit about your own self and everything.
Okay, well, I wish I had more good news to share. I'm here with you today because I write about education and politics.
Right.
And if you're in a state like North Carolina, where you are, your Republican legislators have been very busy dismantling your public education system and trying to shift the state in a direction where taxpayers will now pick up the tab for your wealthiest residents who already send their kids to private schools, and really putting the state on a path towards defunding the schools that the majority of kids go to. And it's not just North Carolina. We are watching this play out all over the country. And that we have state after state now where lawmakers are basically committing their states to paying for these enormous school voucher programs, even as they're slashing taxes on their wealthiest residents. And that means that within the matter of just a few years, you're going to see a real sort of collision course as states try to figure out not only how do they continue to fund public education, but how do they fund basic social services for their residents. So that's what I'm paying attention to. And unfortunately, it's not particularly good news.
Yeah, and along those same lines, definitely, Miss Berkshire and everything. I was just wondering, because I know you're over at Yale, and we've actually been having this conversation on this network quite a bit. A lot of people are getting excited about charter schools, and sometimes they want to not do as much funding of the public schools and all along those lines. So I was just wondering your take, because it's not just North Carolina, like you just said, but it's a number of places that are getting away from the notion of wanting to support the public school system. I just wanted your take on that and how we can deal with this as a issue and everything.
It's a great question because, charter schools have been around since the 90s, and they really emerged as an alternative to school vouchers as an alternative to the idea that was very popular on the right, dating back to the aftermath of Brown versus Board in places like North Carolina and other southern states. The idea that states would directly fund private religious education. They were looking for ways to send kids to schools that were not affected by the Brown versus Board ruling. And so charter schools emerged really as an alternative to this, kind of as a compromise education policy. But now what's happened is that original vision of school vouchers, of publicly funded religious education, of segregated education, that's come roaring back. So what does that mean for charter schools? I'd say nothing good, that they are suddenly in a very vulnerable position. I read a piece this week by a longtime education policy observer who said, he was asking the questions, when the music stops, will charter schools have a seat? And the answer is very unclear, because what's happening in states like North Carolina that are going all in for school vouchers is that charter schools are going to be hard hit as well. They're funded the way traditional public schools are. So when that pot of money shrinks, they're going to be negatively affected as well. And then the other thing you're seeing is an argument from lawmakers in North Carolina and a number of other states is that charter schools are not actually public schools. They're private. And so that means that the kind of, the constitutional imperative to respect things like student civil rights doesn't apply. So as popular as we have seen charter schools become, especially in urban communities over the last 2 to 3 decades, they are now entering a really difficult period. And it raises some interesting questions.
Yeah. One of the things that I do when I'm not working with Pod TV is I work with a testing company, one of the larger testing companies. I was just wondering your take on Common Core and some of the things that go on in that space. Like I said, even though I work for the company, I'm not always the biggest fan of standardized testing, but I was just wondering your take on standardized testing and its impact on our education system.
Yeah, well, it's funny because almost everyone you talk to these days will say exactly what you just said. I'm not the biggest fan of standardized testing because really no one is. And we look around at what's happened over, to our schools since No Child Left Behind came to us in the 2000s. And we've watched as what schools do narrows and narrows. And especially if you're in a community where the kids have high needs, where resources are not abundant, those kids are spending all their time being prepped for tests. Nobody likes that. But you asked me about Common Core, and I think that's really important because so much of what we're seeing unfold in states like North Carolina today is this ongoing backlash against the Common Core, which was an effort to really, strengthen federal reach into the schools and to say, you know what, it doesn't make sense for Massachusetts to have one set of standards and North Carolina to have another set. What if we could all agree on what the standards could be and we'll just teach to those? Well, the problem was that there was no democratic process. We didn't all get to agree, especially, both people on the right saw this as federal overreach, as a nefarious plan on the part of the Department of Education. But critics of standardized testing also saw, something that they didn't like playing out, and that was this effort to really control what schools teach and overturn local control. So I would say that while I pay a lot of attention to the damaging effects of standardized testing, I don't think we pay enough attention to just how big that backlash was. We know about the Tea Party and what a big role they turned out to play in the politics we're watching unfold right now. Well, Common Core was a big part of that story.
Yeah, no doubt about that and everything. One of the other things that we talked about on this network and just in general, and I've got friends that are involved in it and everything, but how much do you think it is important for us to teach the various parts of our history, including some of the warts and all? I know that some people have been critics of what some people would call critical race theory and all along those lines. But I just wanted your take on the importance of us learning all of our history, whether it's even the Holocaust or whether it's slavery or a number of other things as well.
Well, it's interesting that, like the media would really have us believe that this is a hugely controversial topic. But if you look at the polls, there is widespread agreement among parents and non-parents across party lines that we need to teach. We need to give kids a comprehensive view of the history, warts and all, as you put it. And then I think what's really interesting and encouraging is that when you look around at candidates who run on the platform of limiting what schools can teach and teachers can talk about, those candidates, whether they're running for state level office or at the school board level, have not done well. That for all the talk about something like parents' rights becoming a political issue that was going to galvanize parents and lead them back to the Republican Party, that has not happened at all. In fact, we have seen the opposite, including in states like North Carolina, that when they are confronted with the possibility of somebody like a Michelle Morrow in your state, who's running to be the state's top official overseeing the schools, when they hear that kind of extreme rhetoric, not only do they not support that candidate, they are crossing party lines in order to oppose them. And so I think it's really important to sort of tune out the overly simplistic media narrative we've been fed over the past few years, because these candidates are not actually doing well.
Well, and along those same lines, I'll bring in some of our other panelists as well very shortly, and all along those lines. But one of the things that one of our network founders, Nick Palvaden, he's actually with us today, so hopefully he'll be joining us. I think he's actually visiting his home office in Utah, even though he's based here in North Carolina and all along those lines. But he oftentimes talks about fiscal literacy, and sometimes he would like us to have our school kids learn the U.S. budget and the government budget, as well as maybe even the entire Constitution along those lines. But I just wanted your take on where we are in terms of teaching some of these critical skills in life in the school system as a educator yourself and one that studies these education policies.
That's another issue where there's really broad support among huge swaths of the public. They like the idea that kids are going to come out with the skills they need to survive and thrive in the world. But we should be careful that the cry for back to basics has an old history in this country, and you hear it raise its head anytime the schools grow more diverse. And so we should pay attention to what's getting crowded out by the call for a back to basics curriculum. And then just a note about financial literacy. It's an issue here in Massachusetts. There's a big push to get that into the schools. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but fiscal literacy is not going to fix poverty. And sometimes I think people start to convince themselves that it will, that if we just teach kids to balance a checkbook, well, of course, these days they don't need a checkbook, but if we teach them financial literacy, somehow they're not going to be poor. And I think that's a really overly simplistic view of the world.
And just really quickly before I bring in Rick Rosner and some other folks as well and everything, what is your take on us learning skills that are newer skills, such as AI and some of the computer things that are going out there as well? So is this something you think that we need to do more of? Because a lot of people will be thinking that we probably need to get more of our folks engaged in coding and a number of other things in that space. But I just wanted your take on that.
My take on it is that it would be a real mistake to tether too tightly what kids learn and schools teach to the demands of the workforce and the emerging job market. Because on the one hand, it sounds great, right? Like kids are going to leave school with something like coding skills. Well, what if that's the only skill that they leave with? Right? Like we want critical thinkers. We want kids who are able to hold all kinds of jobs. So make schools relevant, but don't make the mistake of letting today's employers determine what kids learn.
And just really quickly along the same lines, like I said, I'm gonna bring in Rick and Sasha, and I may even get Sasha's hour up with the next question. I'm great at asking everything, but I am actually a fan to some degree of some of the protests that go on, including some of the protests on our college campuses, and I don't have as much non-faith as some people do in our young people, and you actually teach at or are involved with Yale and everything. So I just wanted your take on our youth, and are you as upset as some people are when they are deciding to call for protests, whether that's around Israel or whether that's around the climate or a number of other things? But I just wanted your take on our young people, because I'm a big fan of critical thinking, and I think that sometimes our young people are exercising their critical thinking and bringing out their thoughts on issues that they are passionate about. But that's just my opinion. I was wondering yours.
Yeah, well, as someone who teaches all kinds of students, I can't help but chuckle when I see these accounts in the media of students having been indoctrinated. I teach a course on the politics of public education, and I make a point of exposing my students to as much thinking across the political spectrum as possible. And I also bring in conservative guest speakers and who are, consistently surprised and impressed by the critical way that the students engage these issues. And in addition to that, I teach inside a prison. I teach in the Boston College prison education program. And so I put your question to my incarcerated students and asked them, what do you think of the protests? And I found that they were very sympathetic. But one question they had is, why all the attention to this issue? Why are students not more concerned about issues that are playing out closer to home? And I didn't have an answer for that. And I'm eager to put that question to my traditional students on campus.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see just along those same lines and everything, because you just mentioned that you work in a prison. Do you think that we do enough of a job in terms of, even with education, making sure that those that go into the prison system develop skills and everything? As Sasha and the others know, the last couple of days I've been attending a conference that y'all can tell I'm not there today and everything, but it was a conference around economic development, and I ran into somebody from upstate New York that has actually went through the prison system and is he and his business partner are building the food trucks that we see around, because they were trained in welding, and so they have a company that is literally building the food trucks that are all over the country. But I'm pretty sure that they learned that skill of welding when they were in prison and everything. But I just wanted your take as to whether, one, whether rehabilitation can take place, and two, if we're doing enough of a good enough job trying to create rehabilitation for those that are in the prison system.
I teach in a program through Boston College where my students are earning a full bachelor's degree. They will graduate. The first cohort is graduating this fall, and they'll be graduating with a full bachelor's degree in the liberal arts. And the challenge for them, a number of them will be getting out. And so many of the job opportunities are what you're describing, right? They're aimed at folks who learned a trade, or their entry level job positions. But we haven't yet started to think about opportunities for, like my students my first student who's graduating, he wants to be an urban planner. I've got one who's nicknamed the professor, and his goal is to return to the facility in order to teach. And so I'm fortunate enough to be at a place where there are many, many educational opportunities, but of course there are never enough. And the rehabilitation impact is absolutely profound. I really encourage anyone who has the opportunity to teach in a prison to do that.
Yeah, just really quickly as I bring in Rick, like I said I was going to do and everything. What is your take on the education system in general? So where do you think we are as a country in education? Because I keep hearing a number of statistics that talk about our education declining and us not even being in some categories in the top 20 around the country and all along those lines. So I just wanted your take on where we as a country are in our education system.
We've been hearing a narrative like that since the 80s. And you might be surprised that if you actually look at what's happened to student achievement in this country over the last few decades, you might be really surprised to see that it's wildly at odds with the narrative. And now we're at a moment in time where our public education system is more vulnerable than it ever has been. There are entire states that in the near term will begin to dismantle their public education systems, shift students into private schools, and then ultimately require parents to start to pay for the privilege of educating their kids themselves. This is an absolutely terrible development. And one of the real challenges we face is that what you just described, this widespread sense that our schools have failed, we carry that so deeply that now that we really need people to explain why public education is so vital, it's hard to even find the words to do that.
Rick, you had a question. I was going to bring in that too.
I just wanted to say a couple things. The charter schools are in most cases a scam to strip public schools of money and resources. In standardized testing, I know a lot about the SAT, and it was severely wounded by COVID. The SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, is a massive waste of tens of millions of students' hours every year studying for a test that doesn't give them much transferable skills and doesn't give college administrators, admissions officers, any additional information about how well a kid will do if admitted to that college. And so it's good that under COVID, the SAT became optional at thousands of universities, because you can't give a group administered test in a classroom when you can't put students in classrooms because of COVID. And the SAT and to a great extent the ACT went away, which is a good thing, because it like I said, waste of time. But now that COVID is kind of over, the SAT is coming back, which is unfortunate. Harvard's requiring it again, and a lot of other colleges.
Yeah, just really quickly, we've got Nick Palveda, who's one of the founders of the network, and Kev Calhoun, who's right next to you and everything, the other founder of the network as well. But I know that Nick has been very much involved in this education space, so he may even have some questions for you as well.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I do agree with Rick's assessment of the SAT in general and all the testing that comes from ETS in Princeton, New Jersey. It only measures one metric. How much did you study for the SAT? Other than that, it's really kind of a worthless exam. But ETS out of Princeton, New Jersey, also produces the GMAT, the SAT, the LSAT. I took all those crazy tests, and they only had that one metric to go to. I was in the business school. I was in the MBA school when I was 19 years old. Now let's go look at the U.S. education system. At first, I did agree with you. The public education system needed funded. Until I worked in the public education, and unfortunately, I'm a product of both parochial schools, which is basically a Catholic school, and public schools. So I went to both of them younger. Then in college, I went to public and private schools. And here's really the difference, as my dad said. When I went to parochial schools, he goes, I paid for your tuition twice. Once when I paid real estate taxes, and again when I paid your tuition. So what charter schools do is and I'm glad North Carolina is moving toward charter schools because of my personal experience with the public school system recently. Here's what's happening with public schools, which you didn't mention. Number one, they are failed. And by international metrics, the U.S. public school system, none of our schools are in the top, none of our students graduate in the top 25 of any country in the world. And that's just the problem of the public schools. Problem number two, 80% of all funding didn't go to get better teachers and frankly, better classes. It went to administrators to support all the crazy administration that comes out. Now let's go look at the charter schools. Here's the fact. Now that the person, it doesn't really affect the wealthy people. They're going to go to private schools no matter what. It affects middle class people. If middle class want a good education, now they only need to pay for it once. And that's because they get vouchers for what they would have spent in real estate taxes to go to a charter school. Now, why would they do that?
So you're actually confusing. You're confusing a whole bunch of different stuff. I'm not sure what the format is for the rest of this, but this is kind of crazy.
Yeah, you just asked.
Wait, time out, Mark. Let's listen to what's crazy about it. I was talking about a metric that the United States school system, which you can look up on the IT essay that we're not in the top 25. The United States isn't on any metric in math, reading, etc. Show me what's crazy about that. And then show me what's crazy about parents only have to pay tuition once in a charter school that spends money on child's education and not administrators. Tell me why I'm crazy.
So I'll start with the second part. First of all, I'm not sure you understand what a charter school is.
Well,
Charter schools are public schools. There's no tuition involved, right? While states fund them differently. I was merely, I think you're conflating charter schools and private schools. I made the point.
I want to interject here just to, charter schools are actually ran by a board of the parents from what
sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not. It really depends on what state you're in.
But what they are intended to do is to provide a smaller institution in certain communities to provide the needs that community really needs for children who need something special. And that's what I saw the charter schools in some of our local areas being was a means to provide a smaller institution, more intimate for the children to provide them the needs.
Just hold a second, Kim, just so we can get some definition, because like I said, Mr. Berkshire is involved in the whole education system. So in your mind and everything, Jennifer and everything, what is the definition of a charter school when you are thinking of people talking about charter schools? Because I've heard, as you just said, a lot of different definitions, and I've even got a friend of mine that is involved in the charter school movement. Howard Fuller is very much a charter school advocate and everything along those lines. And I actually went to, he's how I got to Marquette, because he was a civil rights activist here in North Carolina, and through a family connection is how I managed to get to Marquette and all along those lines. So if you'll just talk about what a charter school is, and even if you have knowledge of Howard, I'd love to hear your thoughts around him as well.
I actually had the pleasure of visiting Howard Fuller's charter school in Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. And one of his mentees accompanied me to the prison where I teach just this week. So charter schools are publicly funded but privately run. And I think where it can get really confusing is that in addition to the kind of individual schools, the one-offs that Kim was talking about, which can be founded by community groups, they're run by groups of parents and teachers. There are also big charter networks, including for-profit networks. And so that gets really confusing to people. And so often what happens is that the distinctions are, people start talking about private schools and then they end up talking about charter schools. If you heard what I told Mark earlier, I'm actually worried that charter schools are going to be hurt by the dramatic swing towards private school vouchers. Charter schools serve 3 million kids, overwhelmingly minority and low income. Now we're suddenly they are now left with, with it's unclear who their allies are. And so, as those of us who are worried about the public education system, like it or not, charter schools are part of that public education system. So that's why I was a little confused by by Nick's sort of antagonistic spirit.
Just really quickly, and I'll bring Nick back and everything. And I think Rick had a question as well and everything. But just out of curiosity, one of the other things we were hearing about in education is this notion that the teachers aren't being paid enough. And we even heard that a lot during the pandemic and a number of other times as well. So as an education advocate and everything, what is your take as to how we are doing in terms of the pay? Because even Nick alluded to the administrators getting some good pay, but we don't know necessarily the teachers are getting what they deserve and everything. So just wanted your take on teachers' pay.
Yeah, it's the top reason why teachers are leaving. And so if you're in a state like North Carolina that's suffering the worst teacher shortages it's had in a generation, you want to ask, why is there not a serious effort to raise teacher pay? And the answer to that is that one, it costs a lot of money. But two, I think that Nick's point of view really in many ways represents there's a broad shared agreement that our teachers really aren't worth paying more because they're lousy. And they must be lousy because we look at the sort of international statistics that he was referring to, and we, say, why is Estonia beating us out? It must be because of our bad teachers. And so you'll see endless efforts to figure out a way to pay teachers. We're only going to pay the good ones. And you know what that means? We're going to define good based on who is the best at raising student test scores. But the problem, as we were talking about, is that we all also agree that that's not a metric that measures what we really care about. So I think that's kind of where we're stuck. And then more and more, you're going to see states like North Carolina moving to a system where they fund schools that don't require teachers to be certified at all. And I think if your concern is, like we just heard from Nick, that our public education system has failed, moving to a system where we require no training or degree from our teachers seems like an odd way to address that.
Just really quickly, along those same lines and everything, there's been some conversation here on the network and other times as well around the notion of meritocracy and things being developed on this merit system. So I was just wondering, as an educator, what is your take on meritocracy? And on the opposite side of that, are we doing enough to advance vocational skills as well? So I know that those are two different conversation points, but I just wanted your take on both of those.
Well, we heard two different people railing against the SAT. And I think it's been really interesting to hear so many different prominent voices insisting that we've got to bring the SAT back to our elite institutions because that's going to deliver us the kind of meritocratic system. But the problem is that no one really believes that, right? That what a test like that does is essentially launder privilege, and so the more people are convinced that the only way to get decent life chances in this country is to go to an elite institution that very few people can attend, the more distorted our politics will be. And I think part of the reason that these crusaders against DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Their shorthand for it is didn't earn it. The reason that this extreme point of view has actually found a foothold among, affluent suburban parents is that they are so concerned about getting their kids into Yale or Duke or Princeton that they are essentially, easy pickings for what is actually like a really, really damaging and frankly inaccurate argument.
So you mentioned Estonia, which has some of Europe's best education system. And Estonia is one of the most technologically advanced nations in the world, and they immerse their kids in tech. And another thing they do that, that's kind of tough. But an easy thing to do is they feed their kids. That there are the kids get breakfast, they get lunch. It's cheap. It's in America, it's about $6 a day to do that for every kid. But then you have states run by Republicans, who try to show how tough they are by denying these kind of resources to kids. And like Oklahoma had a terrible governor a decade back where they starved the schools of so much money that Oklahoma couldn't even have school 5 days a week. They had to go to 3 and 4 days a week.
I agree with you, Rick. That particular case, when it comes to poverty in America, there was a whole book hit the New York Times recently, and I got it, Poverty in America. 1 million kids right now live in poverty. They're basically homeless. And I'd like us to do a show specifically to address that area because none of the major media, including our liberal media, addresses poverty on a daily basis or a weekly basis, but we will do that. Like I said, years ago, you could get me to change my mind because I went to public schools and they were good. But when I taught there, I can tell you it had changed a lot. Even the teachers were telling me now. It could change from state to state. Maybe Massachusetts is okay. But I have now become a proponent of charter schools, and private schools because of the failure of the public school system. In terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, I don't know how I tell my kids, well, yeah, you worked hard in school, you got good grades, you did work hard, you got good SAT scores, but you can't go in because the seats are available only for Palestinians.
All right.
I just don't buy the racism on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So a hardworking kid, no matter where they're from, is denied a seat because they're not a Palestinian, which is what Northwestern University's policy is right now.
The gentleman in the top has had his hand raised for a long time.
Yeah,
and I'm hoping that he doesn't want to just make a speech.
Yeah. First off, Jennifer, I want to start off by saying I truly appreciate you. Everything you have said, a lot of things I completely agree with. That's why even in the chat, I typed in preach. And I like to think about solutions and things that we've talked about. We can talk like Nick till we're blue in the face and make up random things. What I want to think about are solutions. One of the things that you brought up earlier about is the shortage on teachers that is really a problem. And one of the things when I think about the shortage of teachers, one of the issues is the student loan issue that teachers run across.
Absolutely.
Is it possible, or would it be a potential solution to where how we did free community college? Mm-hmm. Could we advocate for teachers to receive some type of lower discount in their tuition or even free tuition? Mm-hmm. Because instead of them working 3 to 5 jobs to pay off that tuition loan, would it be a solution to do that where we give free tuition for teachers?
Absolutely. I mean, all kinds of things are possible. And I think what's really discouraging is that states are moving in the exact opposite direction and embracing a viewpoint that I would describe as sort of any warm body will do. And so instead of making it more affordable to become a teacher and stay a teacher, what they're doing is saying, we're going to let anybody into the classroom. We're now starting to see states saying, we're going to let you be a teacher and you don't even have to have a bachelor's degree. And I guarantee you that whatever Nick's problems are, whatever his critique is, those kinds of policies are not going to fix it, right? We are not going to realize our age-old dream of finally conquering Estonia by allowing 18-year-olds into the classroom.
If it's really quick,
I've tried teaching. I have no training in teaching, and boy, do I suck at teaching.
But just really quickly, and this is a question for you, Jennifer, and everything. And Sasha's here; he's involved in the chess space as well as the music and the investment space, and is also very much of a advocate for the Ukrainian people and all along those lines. But I was just wondering your take, because one of the things that I get frustrated by is when we lose some of our creative things, because whether it's a music or whether it's the arts, that is a skill set that can help learn critical thinking and all along those lines. But it is one of the first ones to get eliminated whenever there is one of these budget crises. But I just wanted your take on the importance of these kinds of educations.
Absolutely. And think about it now. One of the things that we're so worried about is this chronic absenteeism problem. And it's everywhere. And if you actually talk to kids and listen to them, so many of them will say, I don't see any reason to show up. There's nothing I really care about here. And that those creative programs are the things that really speak to kids. So it's so short-sighted to cut things like music and art and literature when money gets tight.
Just really quickly, just help me back. So I was also going to ask Jennifer, because I asked her earlier and I didn't really get the answer and everything. But what is your thoughts around vocational education, and are we doing enough to put vocational education out there?
So I think it's great. I think the concern, what we've seen in the past, is that certain kinds of kids will inevitably get steered into the welding program, right? The elite kids get to sit around the seminar table and read the entire Macbeth, what I really worry about is we are marching full steam ahead towards entrenching inequality, not just beyond what we have now, but back towards what the country looked like in the 1920s, which is the reason why we required kids to go to school in the first place. So absolutely supportive. Big believer in unions, right? Like if we're going to have vocational programs, let's also make sure that they pay off on the other end, but let's not crowd out all of the other things. And especially like ask kids to commit to essentially blue collar careers as young as 6th grade. You see that happening in certain states now.
Are most schools still doing tracking? Because I know when I was in school, and this was back in the late 70s, kind of to what you were alluding to, you were having a 3-track system. You were either going to go the college track, which I was on, or you were going to vocational track. And then there were some people that, even though it wasn't an official track, were going on kind of the military track and all along those lines. But I just wondered if that's something
there's
continue.
Yes, there's lots of tracking. And the reason is because we expect our schools to do completely contradictory things. On the one thing, our schools are going to make everybody equal. On the other hand, everybody is going to soar to their fullest potential, right? Think about those things. They're contradictory. And so what you end up with is these tracks. And it's really, it's when you can find examples where schools have gotten rid of tracks, but it's not easy. It's not easy, especially when you're in a community where affluent parents are loath to get rid of the sort of extra high intensity courses that they see as necessary to get their kids into elite colleges.
Yeah.
Going back to the creative side, that's the fun part.
Yeah. That's the fun part.
Yes. So what things do you see in terms of innovation wise coming down the pipe in the education arena? Because, when Khan Academy came down, that was phenomenal. And I know that there are teachers using it in schools today. The magic of Coco Melon and Baby Shark, which are educational still, even though they're annoying songs, but they're still being used in a lot of schools to educate kids in various different ways. What do you see coming down, headed our way educationally, that, people like myself who are fathers that have kids in schools right now can look forward to and prepare for?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because on the one hand, the tech stuff is clearly, more of it is coming, including AI, and you can look at, there are schools that are doing really interesting stuff with it. But post pandemic, people are also really wary of tech. There's a growing movement to get phones out of schools, but also just a backlash against tech in general, right? The idea that we were sold promise about ed tech that was never delivered upon. And so it's, like some of the innovations we're seeing are actually tech free, getting kids communicating again directly, teaching them how to look at something other than their phones, and getting them outside. And so that's really interesting because in some ways it means, going back to an earlier model of what schools look like.
Speaking of an earlier model along those lines, speaking of an earlier model, because there was definitely a major celebration that is going on today, and I just wondering, because there's also been, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, this push to pull back and reverse some of the gains that we made in society, and this is the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. So I was just wondering your take on where we are in the sense of desegregation and the victory of Brown versus Board of Education. And do you feel that there is a pushback, kind of like what happened with Roe versus Wade, that we may even see some of these gains reversed?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so much of what's happening in our politics today can be explained by the backlash against a decision like Brown versus Board, that we think of that as in the past. But not only did it never go away, but you have huge swaths of the country that have basically been organizing and trying to figure out ways, how can we remove our kids from the constitutional imperative that we be a more equal country. And so now, in addition to race, that extends to things like gender. So the Biden administration has been really insistent on expanding what we call Title IX to expand protections in schools of LGBTQ kids. And so you now have something like 17 states are suing to say we will never respect that in our schools. So we are living through an intense period of backlash. And what it's really a backlash against is the idea that we should have equality as a goal. And so you now have, loud voices, influential voices saying, we've gone too far in this effort to make the country more equal. And what we need to do is to start rolling it back. And you actually heard Nick making that case, saying, I might believe this thing in the abstract, but I'm not, my kids shouldn't have to give up their opportunity in order for somebody else to realize it because of their ethnicity or the color of their skin. And that, that argument resonates with to an expansive group of people. And that is why this backlash has such momentum right now.
There are all these gaps that work together to disadvantage students. You got the wealth gap, you got the tech gap, the skills gap, and which really can lead to an intelligence gap that a kid who knows how to use technology is effectively smarter than a kid who doesn't have that technology. Nobody gets lost anymore because we all have map apps. Essentially, we're all navigation geniuses now, unless you don't have access to the technology. One more thing is, when you look at what the SAT measures, the thing the SAT measures most effectively is parental income. That because the wealthy families know how to get the kids taught on the SAT, and poor families don't even know that you should teach the kids how to take the SAT. So yeah, we got to get every kid going to school should have some kind of gizmo, a computer, a tablet, to have access to tech.
Yeah, but then you've got people like the New York governor, who I believe made the statement of that a lot of African Americans don't even know how to operate a computer or something like that. Was what I'm paraphrasing, but I know you know the quote that I'm thinking about, Miss Jennifer, and everything. But I know she got in a lot of hot water for it.
Well, I think it's worth just stepping back and acknowledging that, we have this uniquely American view, and it's unique to us. Other countries do not view the world in the same way. We expect our schools to help kids overcome the unbelievable poverty we have in this country. And then we are absolutely crushed when they are unable to do that. And so we're constantly trying to figure out, well, what's the thing we can do that will finally enable our schools to fix poverty? But if you look at a country like Estonia that we've been talking about, they don't start. That's not the role they expect their schools to play. And often what you find is that countries don't start from the point of view that they're going to educate all kids, right? That they don't start from the point of view that you can have serious learning disabilities and attend a school. Those kids are just brushed to the side. And so whenever we talk about something like the tech gap or the wealth gap, that's what we need to start with, that we have huge divides in this country, and we're unique in believing that schools can address those gaps. And then our crushing disappointment with our public education system is a reflection of that.
Yeah,
so Estonia has 1.4 million people. We have what?
Exactly.
250? So they can do artisanal education.
Yeah.
And, we are this giant ship that's really hard to steer.
Just really quick, did you have any thoughts? Because you're over there in Canada and all along those lines. I know we've got your show coming up in about a few minutes, and then I definitely wanted to give Ms. Jennifer a chance to tell how she can be reached and any books or things that she wants to plug as well. But if you had any quick question for her also, since you've been listening intently. Sasha?
Yeah, thank you. I'll give you, in essence, everything what you talk about, education and equal opportunities and all that. I will summarize it in a minute and a half. I was young. I was in a top music school in the city of Odessa in Ukraine, which is now being destroyed for the first time after Second World War. It's now being systematically destroyed by Russia. Now, in that music school, it was a really elite music school, and not only in the city, but in the country, and not just Ukraine, but Soviet Union. I had a fantastic music teacher, violin teacher, and there were 12 students. And once he told to my father, my late father, of course, and he told him that, look, the system is designed the way that I need to have 12 students in order to get decent pay. If I will have only 2 students, I will not get paid. So you must have 12 students class minimum. Out of 12 students, 2 are extremely talented and probably will become a concert violinist or something like that. The other 10, some of them will be a little bit better, some of them will be worse, but it doesn't matter. I give them a minimum of what they need to know about music and violin, and I don't spend a lot of time with them. Now, with the 2 students, very promising students, very talented, I'm spending, instead of 45 minutes as it should be, I spend with them hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes give them free lessons because I can see the talent. So the question is he right? Is he right to devote all his time and efforts to these 2 talented students and treat the other 10 as a ballast?
Well, I mean, that in many ways, that is central, that is at the heart of what we're fighting about today, right? That our view historically in this country has been that we're going to expect our schools to do 2 contradictory things: help those 2 talented musicians rise as far as their talents will take them, while also helping all the others be as good as they can be.
But it's a fantasy.
And in many ways,
ridiculous fantasy that cannot be achieved. And in fact, if you want to try to help these 10 so-called ballast students, you will diminish opportunities of the 2 very bright and talented students. It does not make sense, and you will become mediocrity for all 12. That's it.
Yeah, and that and your view is now widely shared. That you are starting to hear people say, well, I don't know, does it really make sense to send kids with special needs to school? I find that view appalling.
Just really quickly, because we're wrapping up, and I know we've got the Ukrainian show to go as well, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and all along those lines. But Jennifer, if you'll tell folks how you can be reached, and I do hope you'll make it a return trip, because I've definitely learned a lot, and I hope others have as well and everything. But I'd love to have you back at some point. But if you'll tell folks how you can be reached, and if there's any publications that you want to share of yours as well.
Yes, I have my new book right here. It'll be out this summer. It's called The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. You can pre-order it now. It will ship on July 2nd. And my co-author and I set out to explain, why are we always fighting about schools in this country? Why are we fighting about them now? And most importantly, what can we do about it? I'm the co-host of an education podcast called Have You Heard? Every 2 weeks, we put out an excellent episode. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. And people can find me at my website, jenniferberkshire.com.
Well, like I said, I greatly appreciate it. And definitely, Rick, if you had a last comment,
like Sasha's talking about talent. Increasingly, with technology, and you can bridge talent gaps if you've got the resources. Say you've got a kid who's anticipated to grow up to be 6'2", and you're a Tiger parent who wants that kid to be a quarterback. For $30,000, you can buy that kid 2 inches of extra height via human growth hormone. And with AI and all that other stuff, you can, like, if you're fancy, you can do all sorts of stuff to help out your kid, which leaves some of the other kids behind.
Easier put, every kid has potential.
Yeah.
But potentials are very different.
Yeah, but
every kid has potential, and we should actually reach for that potential in that.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
No problem at all. Glad to have you. I've been looking forward to having you back in the near future. Thanks a lot.
Bye.